From the German perspective, the defense of the Reichstag. This was the last battle before the fall of Nazi Germany. Over 1,500 Waffen-SS soldiers faced off against tens of thousands of Soviet troops. They not only repelled multiple assaults from the Soviet Red Army, they engaged in combat for 2 days and nights. They fought to the last man, refusing to surrender. So what exactly happened during the defense of the Reichstag? In April 1945, after 3 years of hellish counteroffensives, the Soviet Red Army finally advanced to the gates of Berlin, the capital of Germany. Since the Central Army Group of Nazi Germany was annihilated by the Soviet forces, they could no longer be stopped. The Soviet Red Army's advance on the Eastern Front. With the surrender of Germany's allies, Italy and Romania, only Nazi Germany remained, fighting alone in Europe. Nazi Germany in 1945 can be described as the darkest year. To the east, the Soviet Army launched a frenzied counterattack. To the west, the Anglo-American allies pressed closer and closer, throughout world history, to be surrounded and beaten by millions of troops. The supervillain who was battered is probably only Hitler. On April 16, 1945, the Soviet Union deployed a total of 2.6 million troops, and began a full-scale assault on Berlin. Thus, Stalin began issuing orders for the Soviet army to seize the last remaining land of the Nazi Wehrmacht at any cost. Subsequently, a large number of Soviet bombers and Katyusha rocket launchers began a heavy bombardment of Berlin. Countless shells fell on the city like rain. At that time, Berlin resembled a hell on earth. The streets were filled with people fleeing in all directions. It is hard to imagine that a nation which once stood proudly above all others, and resisted the entire continent of Europe single-handedly, now it has actually fallen to such a state. At this time, the defending forces in Berlin number only about 760,000, equipped with 1,519 tanks, 9,303 artillery pieces and 2,200 aircraft. However, these figures pale in comparison to those of the Soviet Union. This is simply like a small player facing a giant. With the end of the bombing, millions of Soviet troops began to advance towards Berlin. Launching a full-scale offensive, Hitler nervously observed the situation on the battlefield, unable to believe what was happening now. Under the powerful firepower of the Soviet forces, the German troops were pushed back step by step. The Soviet army pressed forward relentlessly. After several weeks of fierce fighting, the Soviet Red Army had completely occupied the city of Berlin. Only the Reichstag building remained unoccupied. Therefore, Zhukov decided to make the Reichstag the ultimate goal of the end of World War II. Furthermore, he wanted to plant the Soviet flag on the roof of the building. This also means that the complete victory of the anti-fascist war. On the evening of April 29, the Soviet Red Army began to cross the Moltke Bridge, and subsequently captured the German administrative building, planning to launch a full-scale assault on the Reichstag. Around 7 a.m. on the 30th, the Soviet troops dispatched a large number of forces, and began a fierce offensive towards the Reichstag. However, the Soviet Red Army had only advanced 30 meters, when they encountered the stubborn resistance of the Wehrmacht. They relied on the trenches built in the square, and numerous small fortifications, with every door and window blocked by stones, leaving only openings for machine gun fire. Meanwhile, inside the Berlin Opera House on the left, there were also some German troops, launching attacks from behind against the Soviet Red Army. Under the powerful firepower of the Wehrmacht, the Soviet troops, with no cover available, the losses were devastating in an instant. Soon, this Soviet squad was completely annihilated. After the defeat in the first offensive, the Soviet High Command dispatched 3 elite units. They entered the German administrative building and nearby structures. After a brief adjustment, the Soviet Red Army's Guard Battalion launched a second charge. Their main objective in this operation was to capture the left side of the Berlin Opera House. At the same time, Zhukov was also gathering hundreds of artillery pieces on the north side of the Spree River to launch a fierce airstrike against the Wehrmacht, entrenched near the Reichstag. Under such a fierce bombardment, in an instant, the surrounding buildings began to tremble violently. Almost all structures around the building were leveled to the ground. Meanwhile, within the building at the front of the square, a large number of Katyusha rocket launchers were also deployed. They were placed near and on the rooftops of this building, and continuously targeted the German positions. They carried out uninterrupted fire. Immediately after, the Soviet Red Army sent another guard battalion. They surged out from the administrative building like a tide, once again advancing towards the square. They launched another charge. With the cover of artillery fire, they quickly advanced to the front of the German positions in the square. However, they paid an extraordinarily heavy price. Countless Soviet soldiers still fell on this land. Witnessing this scene, a continuous stream of tanks and armored vehicles began to arrive for reinforcement. As the number of troops steadily increased, the German defenses in the square were soon breached by the Soviet Red Army. Around 2 p.m., after capturing the Berlin Opera House, the Soviet troops began actions in the southern area. An attack was launched on the Capitol building. Meanwhile, to the north of the Capitol building, the Soviet Red Army's Guards Army was continuously breaking through the Wehrmacht's defenses. They advanced all the way to the northern defenses of the Capitol building. Shortly thereafter, a steady stream of tanks began to arrive here. As the tanks arrived, the Soviet Guards Army launched an unstoppable assault. They quickly breached the Wehrmacht's positions. They advanced rapidly into the square to regain the situation on the battlefield. The German commanders immediately deployed 88mm flak guns to unleash a frenzied bombardment on the advancing Soviet troops and tanks. Under the intense firepower of the Germans, the Soviet Red Army suffered heavy losses. Many soldiers had not even had time to react. before they fell within the square. To minimize unnecessary casualties, Zhukov decided to wait for nightfall before launching a new round of offensives. On the evening of April 30th, the Führer of Nazi Germany, Hitler, was in his bunker, filled with despair and reluctance, took his own life along with his mistress, Eva. Thus, a demon vanished from the course of history. After receiving news of the Führer's suicide, many high-ranking officials could not accept this reality, and followed the Führer to the grave. Even in the face of this situation, the Wehrmacht surrounding the Reichstag were unwilling to surrender, but chose to fight the Soviet army to the end, in order to completely capture the Reichstag. At 7 p.m., the Soviet army began another assault, starting with the barrage from the Katyusha rocket launchers. Then, thousands of Soviet soldiers, using tank cover, launched their charge. Under the powerful firepower of the Soviet army, the Soviet Red Army quickly advanced to the front of the Reichstag building. Here, elite units of the Waffen-SS were stationed, along with a small number of Wehrmacht troops. They were determined to fight to the death, delivering heavy blows to the charging Soviet forces. Each step they took forward came at an incredibly heavy price. Meanwhile, the Soviet Red Army had long ceased to care about soldier casualties, and began to madly break through to the front of the Reichstag building. With a continuous stream of reinforcements, they finally penetrated into the interior of the Reichstag building. However, what the Soviet forces did not expect was that the German Waffen-SS had already set up machine guns in the hull, ruthlessly unleashing fire upon the surging Soviet soldiers. As if they were hunting, the Soviet army surged in like a tide, and fell like a tide as well. The entrance of the Reichstag was instantly littered with corpses. Wails filled the air. After an hour of fierce fighting, the Soviet army bravely advanced into the interior of the Reichstag. By this time, the Soviet Red Army had been thoroughly enraged. They began a thorough search of all the German soldiers on the first floor. They launched a carpet-like sweep. They carried out a frenzied revenge against the resisting Germans. The fires of Soviet vengeance could be said to engulf the entire building. Everywhere they went, smoke filled the air. Flames erupted everywhere. After several hours of intense fighting, the Waffen-SS on the first floor of the Reichstag had been completely eliminated. Subsequently, large numbers of Soviet troops started charging towards the stairs RST flow, but they were stubbornly resisted by the German army. Every step forward will cost a lot of money. After killing the SS in the corridor, RST flow, the Soviet Red Army then advanced to the third floor of STLOC. However, what awaited them here was the German Foss's newly constructed machine gun line, but the firepower here was not as fierce as before. A few Soviet soldiers narrowly escaped the bullets of the machine guns, and began to launch an attack on the next German position. Just then, two Soviet Red Army soldiers suddenly, under the protection of their comrades, moved as if they were in a no-man land, advancing forward through the hallways of the Reichstag, because they were holding a Soviet flag in their hands. These two Soviet Red Army soldiers silently ran to the back of the Reichstag, and rushed straight to the rooftop of the building. Their military orders stated that they must plant the Soviet flag on the rooftop of the Reichstag before May 1st. After more than 10 minutes of frantic running, around 11 a.m. on April 30th, 1945, Soviet soldiers Koshvayev and Yegorov finally raised the Soviet flag on the rooftop of the Reichstag. This also marked the complete victory of the anti-fascist war in Europe. Although the fighting inside the Reichstag was not over, they were already in a dire situation. After battling this stubborn group of Waffen-SS for 2 days, the fighting finally ended. This protracted defense of the Reichstag, on May 8th, German Field Marshal Keitel signed the unconditional surrender. This also marked the end of World War II. The European theater of war was completely over. Only Japan in the Pacific remained, still fiercely resisting. However, it could not hold out much longer. On July 26, 1945, the leaders of the US, UK, and the Soviet Union at the Potsdam Conference demanded Japan's unconditional surrender. Otherwise, life would only lead to swift and total destruction. However, it was rejected by the Japanese High Command. Thus, with the tacit approval of the UK and the Soviet Union, the United States dropped a big firework on Hiroshima, Japan. The United States dropped another big firework on Nagasaki. 3 days later, the United States dropped another big firework on Nagasaki. These two bombs, the communist flower, caused 400,000 casualties in Japan. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its unconditional surrender. Thus, World War II came to a complete end. What are your thoughts on this?